Brave New World by Aldous Huxley is one of the most bewitching and insidious works of literature ever written. An exaggeration? Tragically, no. Brave New World has come to serve as the false symbol for any regime of universal happiness. For sure, Huxley was writing a satirical piece of fiction, not scientific prophecy. Hence, to treat his masterpiece as ill-conceived futurology rather than a work of great literature might seem to miss the point. Yet the knee-jerk response of, "It's Brave New World," to any blueprint for chemically driven happiness has delayed research into paradise engineering for all sentient life. So how does Huxley turn a future, where we're all notionally happy, into the archetypal dystopia? If it's technically feasible, what's wrong with using biotechnology to get rid of mental pain altogether? Brave New World is an unsettling, loveless, and even sinister place. This is because Huxley endows his ideal society with features calculated to alienate his audience. Typically, reading Brave New World elicits the very same disturbing feelings in the reader which the society it depicts has notionally vanquished, not a sense of joyful anticipation. In Brave New World Revisited, Huxley describes Brave New World as a nightmare. Thus, Brave New World doesn't and isn't intended by its author to evoke just how wonderful our lives could be if the human genome were intelligently rewritten. In the era of post-genomic medicine, our DNA is likely to be spliced and edited so we can all enjoy lifelong bliss, awesome peak experiences, and the spectrum of outrageously good designer drugs. Nor does Huxley's comparatively sympathetic account of the life of the savage on the reservation convey just how nasty the old regime of pain, disease, and unhappiness can be. If you think it does, then you enjoy an enviably sheltered life and an enviably cosy imagination, for it's all sugar-coated pseudo-realism. In Brave New World, Huxley contrives to exploit the anxieties of his bourgeois audience about both Soviet communism and Fordist American capitalism. He taps into, and then feeds, our revulsion at Pavlovian-style behavioural conditioning and eugenics. Worse, it is suggested that the price of universal happiness will be the sacrifice of the most hallowed shibboleths of our culture: motherhood, home, family, freedom, even love. The exchange yields an insipid happiness that's unworthy of the name. Its evocation arouses our unease and distaste. In Brave New World, happiness derives from consuming mass-produced consumer goods, sports such as obstacle golf and centrifugal bumble puppy, promiscuous sex, the feelies, and most famously of all, a supposedly perfect pleasure drug, Soma. As perfect pleasure drugs go, Soma underwhelms. It's not really a utopian wonder drug at all. It does make you high, yet it's more akin to a hangoverless tranquilizer or an opiate, or a psychic anaesthetising SSRI like Prozac, than a truly life-transforming elixir. Third millennium neuropharmacology, by contrast, will deliver a vastly richer product range of designer drugs to order. For a start, Soma is a very one-dimensional euphoriant. It gives rise only to a shallow, unempathetic, and intellectually uninteresting well-being. Apparently, taking Soma doesn't give Bernard Marx, the disaffected sleep-learning specialist, more than a cheap thrill, nor does it make him happy with his station in life. John the Savage commits suicide soon after taking Soma, guilt and despair born of serotonin depletion. The drug is said to be better than promiscuous sex, the only kind of sex Brave New World has practiced, but a regimen of Soma doesn't deliver anything sublime or life-enriching. It doesn't catalyse any mystical epiphanies, intellectual breakthroughs, or life-defining insights. It doesn't in any way promote personal growth. Instead, Soma provides a mindless, inauthentic, imbecile happiness, a vacuous escapism which makes people comfortable with their lack of freedom. The drug heightens suggestibility, leaving its users vulnerable to government propaganda. Soma is a narcotic that raises, quote, a quite impenetrable wall between the actual universe and their minds, end quote. If Huxley had wished to tantalise rather than repel emotional primitives like us with the biological nirvana soon in prospect, then he could have envisaged utopian wonder drugs which reinforced or enriched our most cherished ideals. In our imaginations, perhaps we might have been allowed, via chemically enriched Brave New Worlders, to turn ourselves into idealised versions of the sorts of people we would most like to be. In this scenario, behavioural conditioning too could have been used by utopians to sustain, rather than undermine, a more sympathetic ethos of civilised society and a life well led. Likewise, biotechnology could have been exploited in Brave New World to encode lifelong fulfilment and super-intellects for everyone, instead of manufacturing a rigid hierarchy of genetically preordained castes. Huxley, however, has an altogether different agenda in mind. He is seeking to warn us against scientific utopianism. He succeeds all too well. Although we tend to see other people, not least the notional Brave New Worlders, as the hapless victims of propaganda and disinformation, we may find it is we ourselves who have been the manipulated dupes. For Huxley does an effective hatchet job on the very sort of unnatural hedonic engineering that most of us so urgently need. One practical consequence has been to heighten our already exaggerated fears of state-sanctioned mood drugs, hence millions of screwed-up minds, improvable even today by clinically tested mood brighteners and anti-anxiety agents, just suffer in silence instead. In part this is because people worry they might become zombified addicts, and in part because they are unwilling to cast themselves as humble supplicants of the medical profession by taking state-rationed antidepressants. Either way, the human cost in fruitless ill-being is immense. Fortunately, the net is opening up a vast transnational free market in psychotropics. It would eventually sweep away the restrictive practices of old medical drug cartels and their allies in the pharmaceutical industry. The liberatory potential of the net as a global drug delivery and information network has only just begun. Of course, Huxley can't personally be blamed for prolonging the pain of the old Darwinian order of natural selection. Citing the ill effects of Brave New World is not the same as impugning its author's motives. Aldous Huxley was a deeply humane person as well as a brilliant polymath. He himself suffered terribly after the death of his adored mother. But death and suffering will be cured only by the application of bioscience. They won't be abolished by spirituality, prophetic sci-fi, or literary intellectualism. So what form might this cure take? In the future, it will be feasible, technically, at the very least, for pharmacotherapy and genetic medicine to re-engineer us so that we can become, to take one example among billions, a cross between Jesus and Einstein. Potentially, transhumans will be endowed with a greater capacity for love, empathy, and emotional depth than anything neurochemically accessible today. Our selfish gene-driven ancestors, in common with the cartoonish Brave New Worlders, will strike posterity as functional psychopaths by comparison, and posterity will be right. In contrast to Brave New World, however, the death of aging won't be followed by our swift demise after a 60-odd-year lifespan. We'll have to reconcile ourselves to the prospect of living happily ever after. Scaremongering prophets of doom notwithstanding, a life of unremitting bliss isn't nearly as bad as it sounds. The good news gets better. Drugs, not least the magical trinity of empathogens, entactogens and entheogens, and eventually genetic engineering, will open up revolutionary new state spaces of thought and emotion. Such modes of consciousness are simply unimaginable to the drug-innocent psyche. Today, their metabolic pathways lay across forbidden gaps in the evolutionary fitness landscape. They have previously been hidden by the pressure of natural selection, for nature has no power of anticipation. Open such spaces up, however, and new modes of selfhood and introspection become accessible. The dark age of primordial Darwinian life is about to pass into history. In later life, Huxley himself modified his antipathy to drug-assisted paradise. Island, published in 1962, Huxley's conception of a real utopia was modelled on his experience of mescaline and LSD. But until we can get the biological underpinnings of our emotional well-being securely encoded genetically, then psychedelia is mostly off-limits for the purposes of paradise engineering. Certainly, its intellectual significance cannot be exaggerated, but unfortunately, neither can its ineffable weirdness and the unpredictability of its agents. Thus mescaline, and certainly LSD and its congeners, are not fail-safe euphoriants. The possibility of nightmarish bad trips and total emotional Armageddon is latent in the way our brains are constructed under a regime of selfish DNA. Uncontrolled eruptions within the psyche must be replaced by the precision engineering of emotional tone, if nothing else. If rational design is good enough for inorganic robots, then it's good enough for us. In Brave New World, of course, there are no freakouts on Soma. One suspects this is partly because Brave New World's emotionally stunted inhabitants don't have the imagination to have a bad trip, but mainly it's because the effects of Soma are no more intellectually illuminating than getting a bit drunk. In Brave New World, our already limited repertoire of hunter-gatherer emotions has been constricted still further. Creative and destructive impulses alike have been purged. The capacity for spirituality has been extinguished. The utopian set point on the pleasure-pain axis has indeed been shifted, but it's flattened at both ends. To cap it all, in Brave New World, lifelong emotional well-being is not genetically pre-programmed as part of everyday mental health. It isn't even assured from birth by euphoriant drugs. For example, juvenile Brave New Worlders are traumatized with electric shocks as part of the behaviorist-inspired conditioning process in childhood. Toddlers from the lower orders are terrorized with loud noises. This sort of aversion therapy serves to condition them against liking books. We are told the inhabitants of Brave New World are happy, yet they periodically experience unpleasant thoughts, feelings and emotions. They just banish them with Soma. Quote, 1 cubic centimetre cures 10 gloomy sentiments, end quote. Even then, none of the utopians of any caste come across as very happy. This seems all too credible. More or less chronic happiness sounds so uninteresting that it's easy to believe it must feel uninteresting too. For sure, the utopians are mostly docile and contented, yet their emotions have been deliberately blunted and repressed. Life is nice, but somehow a bit flat. In the words of the resident controller of Western Europe, quote, no pains have been spared to make your lives emotionally easy, to preserve you, as far as that is possible, from having emotions at all, end quote. A more ambitious target would be to make the world's last unpleasant experience a precisely datable event, and from this minimum hedonic baseline, start aiming higher. Quote, every day and in every way I am getting better and better, end quote. Coué's mantra of therapeutic self-deception needn't depend on the cultivation of beautiful thoughts. If harnessed to the synthesis of smarter mood enrichers and genetically enhanced brains, it might even come true. Of course, it's easy today to write congruent tomes on how everything could go wrong. This review essay is an exploration of what it might be like if they go right. So it's worth contrasting the attributes of Brave New World with the sorts of biological paradise that may be enjoyed by our ecstatic descendants. Gene splicers versus glue sniffers, the molecular biology of paradise. The prospect of a lifetime of genetically engineered sublimity strikes some contemporary savages as no less appalling than getting high on drugs. The traditional conception of living happily ever after in heaven probably hasn't thrilled them unduly either, but the unusual eminence of its author has discouraged overt criticism. In any event, the consensus seemed to be that God's PR representatives did a poor job in selling the other place to his acolytes. Today, many people find the idea of winning the national lottery far more appealing, and in fairness, it probably offers better odds. Possibly his representatives on earth should have tried harder to make heaven sound more appealing. One worries that an eternity spent worshipping him might begin to pall. But the death of God, or at least his discreet departure to a backstage role, shouldn't mean that we're doomed to abandon any notion of heaven, and certainly not on earth. Suffering, whether it's merely irksome or too terrible for words, doesn't have to be part of life at all. Unfortunately, the proposal that aversive experience should be limited in toto via biotechnology tends to find itself assimilated to two stereotypes. One, the image of an intracranial self-stimulating rat. Its degraded frenzy of lever pressing is eventually followed by death from inanition and self-neglect. 2. Soma and visions of Brave New World. Cut. 2. Soma and visions of Brave New World. And just as during much of the 20th century, any plea for greater social justice could be successfully damned as communist, likewise today, any strategy to eradicate suffering is likely to be condemned in similar reactionary terms, either wirehead hedonism or revamped Brave New World. This response is not just facile and simplistic. If it gains currency, the result is morally catastrophic. Of course, the abolitionist issue rarely arises. Typically, universal bliss is more or less unthinkingly dismissed as technically impossible. Insofar as the prospect is even contemplated, grudgingly, it is usually assumed that the new regime will be underwritten day to day with drugs or, more crudely, electrodes in the pleasure centres. These techniques have their uses, yet in the medium to long term, stopgaps won't be enough. All use of psychoactive drugs may be conceived as an attempt to correct something pathological with one state of consciousness. There's something deeply wrong with our brains. If what we had now was okay, we wouldn't try so hard to change it. But it isn't, so we do so. Mature biological psychiatry will recognise inadequate innate bliss as a pandemic form of mental health, good for selfish DNA in the ancestral environment where the adaptation arose, but bad for its throwaway vehicles, notably us. The whole gamut of behavioural conditioning, socio-economic reform, talk therapies, even euphoriant superdrugs are just palliatives, not cures, for a festering global illness. Its existence demands a global eradication programme, not idle philosophical manifestos and scientific belles lettres. But one does one's best. The ideological obstacles to genetically pre-programmed mental superhealth are actually more daunting than the technical challenges. To be cured, hypohedonia must be recognised as primarily a genetic deficiency disorder. Designer mood brighteners and anti-anxiety agents to alleviate it are sometimes branded lifestyle drugs, but this is to trivialise a serious medical condition which must be corrected at source. Happily, our hereditary neuropsychiatric disorder is likely to become extinct within a few generations as the reproductive revolution unfolds. Aversive experience and the poisonous metabolic pathways that mediate its textures will become physiologically impossible once the genes coding its neural substrates have been eliminated. We won't miss its corrupting effect when it's gone. In the medium term, the functional equivalent of aversive experience can help animate us instead. Late in the third millennium and beyond, its functional successors may be expressed as gradients of majestic well-being. On this scenario, our descendants will enjoy a civilization based on information-bearing pleasure gradients, whether steep or shallow, we simply don't know. Such a global species project does not have the desperate moral urgency of eliminating the phenomenon of Darwinian pain, both mental and physical, human and non-human alike. Abolishing raw nastiness, sometimes vile beyond belief, remains the overriding ethical priority. One doesn't have to be an outright negative utilitarian to acknowledge that getting rid of agony takes moral precedence over maximising pleasure. But both genetic fundamentalists and gung-ho advocates of better living through chemistry today agree on one crucial issue. There is no sense in sustaining a legacy of mood-darkening metabolic pathways out of superstitious deference to our savage past. When Bernard Marx tells the savage he will try to secure permission for him and his mother to visit the other place, John is initially pleased and excited. Echoing Miranda in The Tempest, he exclaims, "O brave new world that hath such people in it." Heavy irony. Like innocent Miranda, he is eager to embrace a way of life he neither knows nor understands. And of course he comes unstuck. Yet if we swallow such fancy literary conceits, then ultimately the joke is on us. It is only funny in the sense that jokes about Auschwitz are funny. For it is Huxley who neither knows nor understands the glory of what lies ahead. A utopian society in which we are sublimely happy will be far better than we can presently imagine, not worse. And it is we, trapped in the emotional squalor of late Darwinian antiquity, who neither know nor understand the lives of the godlike super beings we are destined to become.